Well, we begin in Kabul, where there's renewed urgency to evacuate thousands of Afghans a day after a bombing killed scores of people trying to flee. ISIL-K claimed responsibility for that attack outside Kabul airport that killed at least 110 people and injured dozens more. The Taliban has condemned the violence and is stepping up security around the airport. And the US is saying it will continue its airlift until the August 31st deadline. But other countries, including the UK, are ending or have already ended their evacuation missions.
Our lives are in danger and we are not in a good situation, and the whole world should know about it.
We came here because we're supposed to catch a flight, but the situation is very bad and the roads are blocked. We also came here yesterday, but there was an explosion and people were killed and wounded. They are now allowing people into the airport, including those who have worked for foreign institutions and journalists and those whose lives are in danger. So the people are in a very bad situation.
We are now hearing from Taliban sources that the death toll is above 175. Charlotte Bellis now reports from a hospital in Kabul.
Secunda had served as an Afghan soldier. He went to Kabul airport on Thursday, hoping his service would be enough to qualify him for an evacuation flight. The father of 4 was killed at the gates.
He's a martyr because he died for a good cause. He wanted a better future for his family because there's no work here and so much fighting. He wanted out of this place and he died for it.
Secunda spent his childhood and final days under Taliban rule. He wanted life to be different for his children and hoped to raise them in the United States. But people here say the US has offered little and taken a lot.
All this misfortune, all the explosions, all the suicide attacks, all this because of the Americans.
Mushta sits outside emergency hospital with her mother. Her uncle has called from California. They are all waiting for news on her father, who survived the explosion and is being treated inside.
They didn't give us permission to see him, and his abdomen and hands were hurt. He was brought here in a cart. We've only seen pictures of him, and he was bloody.
Dozens of the wounded were brought here to emergency hospital. These are some of the most severe. And everyone here had been at the airport hoping for an evacuation flight to escape the violence. Instead, they're Afghanistan's latest victims. In the intensive care unit, patients explained why they ignored ISIL threats and remained outside the gates to argue their case for evacuation. Bilal had tried to get through with his uncle, who had a foreign passport. He said it was a red colour. His uncle died at the scene. In the aftermath, many victims were separated from their family members. Al-Sadallah Husseini went to the airport with 15 relatives.
Maybe some of them be injured. Maybe they escaped to home. I don't know. I can't do anything. I'm here. I don't know where is my family, where is my wife, my children.
As evacuations wind down, this is not how many Afghans expected to see US forces depart. There are warnings of more ISIL attacks at the airport. The Taliban has increased security and expanded the perimeter. For thousands who did not make it onto a flight, it is likely a dream lost. For others, it is so much more. Charlotte Bellis, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Well, for more now, let's speak to Rob McBride. He's also on the ground for us in Kabul. Rob, how is that area around the airport looking today? Are people now staying away?
It remains still extremely tense around the airport itself after the devastation of this attack on Thursday night. But there are still people there, still hoping against hope, especially given the dwindling number of flights that they might be able to get on one. Although it has to be said that the numbers probably are fewer than we have seen in previous days. It seems as though a number of people would be staying away because of the threat, the fear of more attacks. Others probably staying away because they realise at this stage with the evacuation flights starting to wrap up, that they're simply not going to be able to get on one of those flights. But still, people are persisting, and still there is an area of tension, a level of tension at the airport. It has to be said that tension, you don't really feel it here in Kabul city itself. The streets are a lot calmer than they were this time Thursday evening in the aftermath of that really devastating attack. This is the end of the weekend for most people here in Kabul, and the streets have been busy this Friday evening. The Taliban have been out in force, as they have been over the past couple of weeks, although it has to be said they are far less jittery. This Friday evening, we have heard far less gunfire than we did at the same time 24 hours ago. Then it was extremely tense. The Taliban was fearing maybe more attacks around Kabul itself. They were firing shots in the air, trying to keep people away from sensitive areas, possible targets, trying to disperse any groups from gathering. So there was an awful lot of gunfire this Friday evening, very little, the odd gunshot you can hear. The main sounds we hear are from aircraft, the continuing patrols by US military fighters overhead, and the rumble of these big transport planes taking off, which you can hear especially in the evening hours. The noise drifts across from the airport as they take off and lumber into the air. And it has to be said they are noticeably fewer this Friday as all of these different countries start to wrap up their operations, such as this Friday. Italy, Spain, Sweden, they have finished their operations. France is due to finish this Friday, leaving just the United States still continuing its evacuations.
Rob, we heard very recently from the Pentagon that they are still aware of specific ongoing threats, also from the White House that another attack is potentially likely. What's being done to try to stop that?
We've seen some measures taken at the airport, pushing people back further away from this perimeter by a couple of 100 meters or so. More Taliban are making their presence felt there. So they seem to be guarding the airport. But we have had the repeat of this, of the threat that instead of just a suicide bomber, we may see a car bomb being used. That has been the warning from both the US military and from the Taliban themselves. And also the US say that they are prepared possibly for rocket attacks on the airport. So as long as this evacuation exercise goes on, it does remain an extremely vulnerable target, and ISIL knows that better than anybody else. I think this attack has also changed the dynamics here and the relationship and how ISIL is regarded. You know, until last night, ISIL was probably not a big priority for the Taliban. You know, for 20 years, they have had a common enemy in the United States and coalition forces. Last night, that really changed the dynamic here. And so going forward, looking beyond the departure of the American forces here, it's interesting to speculate about what the relationship might be between the US forces and the Taliban in taking on ISIL, because a number of the victims in the Thursday bombing were, of course, Taliban fighters. So they will be seeking revenge, and the Americans can help them.
Rob McBride there with all the latest for us from the ground in Kabul. Thank you, Rob. Well, meanwhile, the Pentagon has also said about 5,400 people inside Kabul airport are still waiting to be evacuated. Its spokesman says that people will be flown out until that very last moment before the August 31st deadline.
What we want to do is preserve as much capability for as long as we can, both in terms of the security footprint. Lives are still the priority, and the lives of our troops, and, of course, the lives of evacuees, and trying to continue to get as many out as possible. So there will be a balance over the next few days as we continue to process through that transition, as we continue to, as what we call, retrograde. And I can't give you a specific number on any given day, but I think you'll see us adjust as necessary to make sure that we're achieving that proper balance. But we will be able to fly out evacuees right up until the last moment. That's going to be the goal.
Well, 2 British nationals were among those who died in the blast. Niamh Barker has more now from London on the British-led evacuation from Kabul, which is now in its final hours.
A group of around 1,000 people, the last to be airlifted out of Afghanistan, have had their paperwork processed and are now within the perimeter of the airport. We don't know how many have already left the country, but within the coming hours, those last remaining people will be taken to various different locations globally. We have learnt, however, that there are around 1,000 eligible Afghans who remain in the country and around 100 Britons, some of them NGO workers, journalists and people who have decided to stay for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them simply weren't able to get on their scheduled flights because of the attacks that took place on Thursday evening and the subsequent lockdown around the airport afterwards. So they've essentially missed their slots. The message from the British government is that it will still be possible to travel overland to the borders surrounding Afghanistan, the Pakistani border, for instance, where the British government have said that officials would be on standby to process people to allow them to eventually travel here to the United Kingdom. But that, of course, raises the prospect of having to set up safe corridors, and that means negotiating with the Taliban. And what we've learned from the British government is that they're now trying to work out what kind of levers diplomatically can be pulled to get the Taliban on side.
Well, meanwhile, Turkey says it's held its first talks with the Taliban. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is considering the group's request for Turkey to run Kabul airport after Western forces withdraw. The Taliban says it will secure the facility but needs technical assistance to run it.
Görüşmelerimizin ilkini de Our friends held the first meeting with the Taliban, and this was a 3.5 hours long meeting under the supervision of our ambassador in Kabul. And if necessary, we will have the opportunity to hold such talks again.
Well, the United Nations is now warning up to 500,000 Afghans could flee the country before the end of this year. It's calling on Afghanistan's neighbours to keep their borders open to those seeking safety after the Taliban took over.
These are dramatic times, and UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has worked with the people of Afghanistan for over 40 years, and we will stand by them and do what we can to support them. In terms of numbers, we are preparing for around 500,000 new refugees in the region. This is a worst-case scenario. While we have not seen large outflows of Afghans at this point, the situation